All right, let's do this thing. So my name's Charles Herring. We're going to talk about catching breaches with NBAD. Does anyone have any idea what NBAD is? Anyone ever heard the term NBAD? Think it's an old Michael Jackson song? No? Okay. So a little bit about me and how I got here. I spent 10 years on active duty in the Navy. My last gig was as a network security officer for the Naval Postgraduate School. And those of you that may have studied intrusion detection system history, which is, 3 people in the world. There was a paper penned by Dr. Dorothy Denning in 1983 called Intrusion Detection Expert Systems. So 83, the whole idea behind catching breaches was first invented. And Dr. Denning is a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. She was there when I showed up for duty in 2000. And one of the things we found inside of a military installation that had a Class B of IP space without NAT or firewalls was it's very easy to rob us. And it became much easier when we started taking exchange students from other countries who were essentially spies. It made it very easy to bring them on campus if they just couldn't access us directly from the internet. So network behavioral anomaly detection is a school of thought on how do you catch things that are currently uncatchable. And so we're going to go through that, just the theory of NBAD, how can you do NBAD, and really the bulk of the talk today is over some breaches that I've been a part of in the last 1.5 years that anomaly detection or behavioral detection has allowed us to catch them and really how we caught those. So full disclaimer, I work for a company called Landcope, which basically is the only company in the world that actually does NBAD, but I promise not to pitch you on that nonsense. So what we'll do some definitions so you know what the words mean that I'm talking about. We'll talk about specifically how NBAD goes about detecting breaches, and then we'll talk about the actual breaches. So what is NBAD, what is NetFlow, and what are the detection schools? So I already mentioned network behavioral anomaly detection is NBAD. Generally speaking, in modern NBAD, it's the data source is NetFlow. The reason that came about is when we first started doing research in NBAD around 2000, there was basically 2 major hubs at the time. There was Naval Postgraduate School working on a project called Terminator, and at Georgia Tech, Dr. Copeland was running a project called Stealth Watch, which is became the product that I peddle. But those were the 2 network behavioral anomaly detection schools. But at those days, it was probe-centric, meaning we would put a probe off of a span or put it in line, and it would look for traffic that was anomalous or a known bad behavior and an alert on that. Around 2004, we discovered that since NBAD isn't really looking inside of the packets, it's looking at the distribution of packets. How many bytes are normally moving between email servers and clients? How many send packets are normally in that mix? And so it's really a metric-based game. And it didn't really matter what's in the payload. So NetFlow became a great source for that because it's metadata on what is happening. And it made it much easier to deploy. Instead of putting probes everywhere, you basically spin up NetFlow, point it at a thing that's doing the processing, and you're able to do NBAD very quickly. That also allowed us to look very deep into the network. Access, so workstation to workstation, workstation to server, server to server, instead of limiting visibility for detection at egress or ingress points. Already mentioned quality metrics. Sometimes because NetFlow is the main data source, anything that parses NetFlow gets grouped in with NBAD or NBA or something like that. But processing NetFlow doesn't make you an NBAD machine any more than a human being is an error processor, right? There's more to the experience than just the data being processed. If you want to start out doing this on your own, there's a great set of tools from Carnegie Mellon's CERT team called Silk. And so you can go out to cert.org, yeah, CERT.org, and pull down Silk. And Silk has a set of libraries called PySilk, which are the Python libraries associated with parsing Silk. And what Silk is it allows you to send NetFlow into the engine. It parses it, stores it, and allows you to query it against different types of checks that we'll talk about today. And Python, PySilk is just a set of libraries that makes it much easier to get into that data stack. So check that out. There's really no in-bad magic quadrant, if anybody here cares about that. But there was an NBA, or network behavior analysis market brief, came out in December 12 from Gartner, and these are the folks listed on that. So, and we'll talk about the difference between NBA and in-bad here in a moment. So when I talk about net flow is both a specific thing and a category. I grew up in Lower Alabama, LA. That's what that LA means. Pensacola. All right. I thought someone was about to say Roll Tide. I was about to lose it. But in Michigan, who would have thought that could actually happen? But so when I sit down for supper, the waitress will ask, "Hun, what do you want to drink?" And I'll say I would like a Coke, and she would say, "What type of Coke?" And I'll say I'll have a Dr. Pepper, because in the South, at least in Alabama, Coke is both all soft drinks and it is a specific soft drink. So net flow is the same way. There is a specific thing called net flow V5, V7, and V9 came into production. It was a standard created by Cisco, and they issued informational RFCs, and NetFlow V9 is in that RFC listed. IPFix is largely the open source version of NetFlow. NetFlow V9 is actually a little bit better than NetFlow V9 in a couple of regards, but that's the RFC attached to that. And so when I talk about NetFlow in this conversation, I'm talking about metadata going across an interface. So as traffic routes across a router or a switch or a firewall and it's aware of that conversation, it's going to create a log entry about that in a metadata format that I'm going to call flow or net flow. Juniper has JFlow, which if you do a PCAP on it, it looks exactly like NetFlow version 5, except Juniper would die before they gave Cisco any money on that, so it is JFlow, it is not NetFlow. CFlow, NetStream, anything metadata about a conversation is really what I'm talking about here. And so you can notice at the bottom, really the basic NetFlow records. This IP talking to this IP on this port from this port for this many bytes at this time across this interface. That's what we're talking about for raw data. So that's NetFlow in a nutshell. We can talk about that more some other time when I haven't had 4 of those things. But there's 3 ways to catch anything in information security. The first one and the most venerable one is signature-based detection. And so if we're looking at this from a physical security realm, this is really inspecting the object before it's ingested by the victim or the target. So if I receive a wonderful frosty beer and I look for things like mold floating on it, I'm inspecting the object before I take it in. Just give me a second. I'm sorry, I started thinking about the beer. Love Grand Rapids. So you inspect the object before you ingest it, looking for things that you know are bad. Chemicals, composition, things that you know will hurt the target as they ingest them. That's signature-based detection. So in IPS, you're looking for the packet. There's something about that packet you know is bad. It's attached to exploit CVE XYZ. Don't let it in. Antivirus is inspecting the object, in this case being the file. If that file has certain markers on it, we know it's associated with a specific malware variant. Content filters, same thing going. You're looking for a request of URLs that are known bad. Behavioral detection is looking for what happens after you ingest it. For instance, you might not need to see the beer on my podium to know that I've been drinking a beer. You can tell a little bit by my behavior right now. The fact that I'm pointing a lot is one thing that I probably wouldn't do if I wouldn't have had a beer. But what happens after the object is ingested? How does that impact the behavior of the victim or the target? Malware sandboxing is a lot like the old cupbearer approach to a king, right? You would have the cupbearer, he would drink it, the king would look at him. If the guy started foaming at the mouth, he says, I'll pass on that. That's not something I really want to get involved with right now. Let's bring out a new cupbearer and a new thing of wine. So that's really malware sandboxing. Put it in a sandbox, watch what happens. If the behavior is a known bad behavior, then you can assume the object that was ingested is bad. So sandboxing, NBAD does a good bit of this. So if you don't need to know what the endpoint ingested to know that it shouldn't be scanning the network. that it shouldn't be breaking policy, that it shouldn't be doing onion routing, right? Those types of things are behaviors that follow the ingestion of a bad object. And anomaly detection, you're still watching the behavior of the host, but you're watching it for deviation against known good behavior. So if someone shows up to work every day at 6 a.m. in the morning, and then one day they show up at 6:30, that's a little bit weird. If they show up at noon carrying an AK-47 and wearing a meatloaf as a hat, really weird, right? So you're talking about degrees of deviation that can be calculated mathematically. That joke never works. I'm going to keep trying it until it does work. So when you break down how do these detection mechanisms work in concert, signature-based detection is the best for catching known exploits. So when I go to O'Hare, I take my freaking shoes off, and they look for a bomb in my shoes. And but they know what to look for. You know, if I put something else in there, like a vodka, they don't know what to do about that, but they know what to look for, thanks to Richard Reed. And I got really scared, by the way, after they started doing that, and then the underwear bomber showed up. I'm like, oh man, O'Hare cannot get any worse than this whole thing. Now I'm going to show up in a robe at the whole thing. So, but known signature-based detection is very good at detecting known bad things. Behavioral detection has become very good at zero-day stuff because even though you are using a new exploit, you're doing the same old thing. You're going to steal data. You're going to try to propagate internally. You're going to try to pivot. The behavior, the bad behavior that you do with a host once it's compromised is the same. So if you don't know what the exploit is, you know what the behavior is that will follow. So malware sandboxing, network behavioral detection on the network can help in that. Normally with zero-day exploits, this is the best, one of the best ways to catch that. And then anomaly detection is very good at catching stuff that really has no signature. When you're abusing credentials, and I got beat up a little bit about this when I did this last month about what is credential abuse. What I mean is someone has the ability to log in as you, or the person logging in is being an a-hole, right? So you have a username and a password and you're using those credentials in a way that are inappropriate. So Edward Snowden is a great example of this. He's an administrator. He logged into machines. He's supposed to log into machines. Booz Allen paid him to log into machines. They did not, however, want him to suck down all of NSA's data and walk away with it, right? And so you can't alarm on a signature or Boolean detection to say when an administrator logs in, trigger an alarm. But you can alarm on an administrator normally accesses less than 100 megs of data in a day. If he pulls down 10 terabytes of data, tase that dude and don't let him out of the building, right? That's a proper incident response. And so anomaly detection, again, is watching for what is normal. And then when someone does something abnormal, you're going to alert on that. So how do those approaches apply to NBAD? We're sort of limited in NBAD. If we're using NetFlow as your data source, you don't have the benefit of having the full packet to get in there and look for, you know, SQL injection patterns and those types of things that you could do if you're looking at Ethernet frames. But there are some things you can do in metadata. I'll go through this event earlier. I'll go through it earlier. I went through it 10 minutes ago. Okay, thank you. I'll go through it in a bit. But segmentation violation, vendors lie. I'm a vendor. We actually have clubs where we get together and we talk about how we're going to lie to you. We actually have really great meetings on that. That's not true. That's another lie that I just told as a vendor. I did spend a period of my life working for InfoWorld magazine testing network security stuff. And so the vendor would say one thing, we'd test it, and we'd say, oh, that's not exactly what you said, bro. You know, what's how do we end up here? And inside of a network, the same is true. It's good to trust, but you need to validate it. And so we'll go through some examples in this. But if we put segmentation in place that the guys in HR shouldn't be able to access the protected trade secret data, we need to know if that ever happens, right? We need to be alerted if something breaks down and somehow one of those, an HR person doing that is crazy. But let's say they did it. We need to know. Policy violations. We don't allow onion routing. That's a good policy, you know. There's also a policy shared by the government of Iran, but whatever, you know, there's some things that are not okay. People agreed to it and coming in the network. So if they do those things, you need to be alerted to it, and some of that's going to be available in NetFlow. And the metadata inside of NetFlow is just metadata. There's nothing magic about it. So you can put anything inside a NetFlow v9 or IP fix that you want. You can put the username in there. You can put the URL requested in the NetFlow data. You know, you can put the horoscope of the, whatever you want can be put inside of the metadata. So one of the ways that's been used in several deployments is grabbing the URL information, putting it into the metadata, and then looking for blacklist URLs. So that URL is associated with some ransomware or something. So there's some one good thing about, well, one good thing about. Just give me a second. I'm just in my mind. You guys are actually paused right now. So Boolean detection is a very smart way of offloading a business process to a computer. When we first started doing signature detection, there were just so many alarms coming out of these boxes. And so there's no one had the time to deal with it. It all seemed like noise. And so one of the first things you started to do was, okay, if there's a SQL injection coming in, is that machine that it is hitting, is it even vulnerable? Because if it's not, I'm going to continue to have another dark beer and do something else. Right? I don't care. I don't need to do anything. So that logic that really is associated with incident response plans could be mapped into determining the relevance of detection. So in this case, IDS signatures triggered. Is the machine, the target, vulnerable? After it was hit, did it start disclosing data? If so, trigger, wake everybody up and ruin their weekend alarm, right? And so it's good for offloading data. There are some challenges though. One, it requires you to know what the bad scenario looks like. What are the steps that need to be triggered for an event? And hackers, if they figure out what you think the events are, they can just change it, right? Let's do it a little bit differently. It also requires highly processed data. An intrusion detection system, signature-based system, has to download signatures. It has to parse those on the wire. It has to not drop packets. There's a lot of things that have to happen for it to output CVE, exploit against CVE, XYZ just happen. And so that's another challenge. You have to know what it is. Right? There are more exploits. It is sad. You know, I spent a lot of my time working in the Department of Defense. There are exploits that we will not know about for a long time. I was on a panel yesterday, and people said, you know, patch your machines and run antivirus. I said that only catches the really sucky malware, right? The good malware that's really scary, it's not going to catch any of that, right? And so there are you have to know what to look for inside of this Boolean detection mechanism. And I don't know exactly why I put that last bullet in there. So moving on to something that MBAD is very good at is behavioral analysis. So just looking for things. And this becomes challenging when you try to do this yourself because you're now having to count things. If you're going to count a machine that's doing a slow address scan, you're going to say, okay, that's one SYN packet. Then there's another SYN packet. And so you're on every host now, you have to computationally count and maintain counters on every host as they're doing those things. And then you're going to trigger, that's an address scan, TCP, do something with that. But it is very good at catching scanning. If you are doing those counters, it's good at looking for floods of data associated with DDoS or something else. Flag sequences, like normally you don't start a TCP conversation with, you know, ACK reset. That's pretty weird, the way to start a conversation. The pros of this is you don't have to know the exploit. You just know that's the behavior that comes after, largely connected with GrrCON. Inside of behavioral detection, it's almost always going to be some type of recon behavior. And then, of course, the con, like I mentioned, is computationally it becomes complicated when you have thousands of hosts inside the network that you have to have something in memory saying 0 SYN packets, then 1 SYN packet. Then at some point you have to alert on that. Anomaly detection, the pros are it can catch really hard, impossible to catch stuff. The cons are it's magic. And so there is a lot of computation that has to happen, not just counting everything, but baselining everything, grouping everything, and putting them in proper context, because there's not one normal in any network. There is normal for the clients to the email servers. There's a whole other set of normal that is the scanners to the data center. There are many types of normal. So enclaving or host grouping inside of those spaces are very important. And that changes too, right? It's not one time that you do that. There is a lot of data we're talking about now. We're talking about communications from servers to servers, clients to clients, clients to servers. It is potentially every communication inside the network that needs to be processed, stored, and analyzed. And then we also have to do something, I call it algorithmic calculation here, but it's really index-based alarming. And so what this means is, I mentioned the guy shows up 30 minutes late for work. Does that mean call in the incident response team? If we boil that down, some things are more abnormal than other things. And so how do you deal with that inside of a system, a computer system like an NBAD system? And so one approach that the one I advocate is doing an index-based approach. So something that's a little bit anomalous or a little bit suspicious, we'll increment a counter, a host counter. This host just had a TCP reset. Can you imagine getting an email every time there's a TCP reset? But if you see a TCP reset and then you also start seeing some address scanning, or you start seeing policy violation on top of that, the cumulative behavior becomes increasingly concerning, right? So to deal with that mathematically, you say that's a little bit suspicious, a couple of points to the index. That's very suspicious, ton of points to the index. And then you alarm when the index exceeds acceptable values. And those acceptable values will change, right? There's some things you don't care about. Dude's on GuestNet and he's lost his mind. Let him destroy GuestNet. POS machine lost its, is acting a little goofy. Wake everybody up, right? There's different levels of tolerance based upon how those indexes impact business. So here are some of the things that we can look at. I'm going to look at some histograms. And by the way, I should make a disclaimer. All of these things had to go through legal so many times where this brief was almost computer thing happened at the end. So I had to really sterilize this. There's no company names left in it. And I had to reproduce all of the data graphs as well. So that I didn't say that in a very funny way, so everyone thinks I suck. But this is weird to the human eye, right? You might not necessarily know what this is looking at it. But this looks weird, and all we're looking at, this is a histogram of the bytes per second or bits per second on a relationship. And really, above that line is the traffic coming into, in this case, coming into a server, a web server farm, a group of web servers. And the line going down is the data leaving those web servers. So it looks like a hammer wave. So with anomaly detection, another con is there's no CVE output. It's weird thing just happened with the web servers. And so in this case, you look at it and say, that is weird. My eye says it's weird, but I don't necessarily know what it is. In this case, it's actually a SYN-flood DDoS coming into the web servers with a data exfiltration connected to a SQL injection, sucking the data out. So that's that. In doing these analysis, one nice thing with NBAD, with anomaly detection particularly, is the human eye is very good at picking out these types of anomalies if you have specific scopes. So this one here is internet to web servers, right? And so you're looking at a very specific set of data. It looks funny. And so now you can zoom in. Let's look at the records that led up to this, and we can make a determination. This is a change in service type. Particularly in like PCI environments or HIPAA environments, computers are pretty boring. Like they will do PCI events all day long. Credit card numbers don't get longer. No dude ever walks in with, hey, I got a credit card that has 450 digits on it. They're all like 16 digits. So it's exact same transactions all day long, and no POS machine ever says, I think I want to check out YouTube today, or heard SSH was cool. Let's do that. Let's see what that looks like. So it's very boring in the service profile if you have a tight definition. So in this case, there's classified HTTPS, which means a component of NetFlow is the ability to do deep packet inspection. So with HTTPS, if it is HTTPS, you're going to see SSL key exchanges. But if it's just 443 TCP, something else going on, you're not going to see those exchanges, and you can't classify it as HTTPS. So in this case, there's both a change in volume, and there's also a change in the traffic profile, and that there's something else running on that. This is my favorite, geographic traffic anomaly. If all of a sudden, if you've never done anything with the Ukraine, and now 100 meg of your traffic is going to Ukraine, that's weird, right? And it's really, and we'll talk about one example. If you're a local government, that's really weird. So looking at that time of day, if all your traffic happens 9 to 5, and then you start seeing major transfers at different times of day, that's also a reason for concern. Maybe not as bad as the Ukraine. And then applying this to the user, if a user is in Atlanta, and logged in 40 minutes before they're logged into a machine in Boston, that's anomalous. It's even worse if they're in Atlanta and in Beijing at the same time, right? So those are anomalies and actually impossible. This is a fun one. This is a metric. So we talk about counters, but what if you counted every byte that a host collects from the network every day? I come into work, I collect maybe 10 bytes, maybe 100 bytes, probably more than 10 bytes, maybe 10 megs, maybe 100 megs, whatever it is. What does a normal person do in the day? And then you see a guy like this who just says, you know, I'm taking 11 gigs today. You know, I need 11 gigs of data. Don't tell me that I can't have 11 gigs of data. I was actually on site in Chicago, and just 3 weeks ago. And I'm looking at this and I'm explaining to the folks, and I don't have no idea what the cause of this is, but I said, normally when I see this, someone is quitting. I see their LinkedIn profile changed, I see them suck all the data out of the network, and then a letter of resignation comes, right? They're collecting all that stuff that they feel like is theirs. And so in that case, it was actually the Chief Information Security Officer, and he did leave. So if anyone needs a new CISO, I know a guy, I can't recommend him, but I know him. Data disclosure, how much data is leaving the network. So counting how many bytes does someone send out of a network in a day. There's something that's normal, there's something that's abnormal, there's something that's crazy abnormal, right? So there are different degrees here that we can mathematically compute, those of you that are fans of standard deviation. So and with that said, are there any questions on any of that? And the only reason I'm asking is because if I ask you if there are questions, I can reach for the beer while I wait for you to raise your hands. Okay. Yeah. It depends on the metric. So if you're doing bits per second, that's normally, you can do anomaly on that. Something more precise like a saturation of SYN packets, that's going to be tougher to calculate because you don't know if you missed the SYN-ACK or if it was just sampled. So, but most modern stuff can do line rate net flow. The good stuff can. Okay. Oh, your IS. So yeah, you have a whole other set of problems, and yeah. You're right. So there are ways in dealing with that, and NetFlow might not be the only data source you need for doing the aggregation. Who had that IP address at a given time, and getting down to those metrics are going to help as well. But yeah, but bitrate stuff you can do. But the problem is if you don't have all the data, you can't pivot. You can't pivot to the forensic object that was concerning it. And that's actually a really nice thing about NetFlow, is that you potentially can have forensic records of everything that happened in the network for a year at a very low cost, comparative to trying to do 32U worth of PCAP. And so it becomes much easier to query. But if you're doing sampling, it's like having a camera a video camera that takes a picture every 2 minutes, and you hope I'm being robbed then, right? That the guy comes in at that moment and doesn't know about the sample rate. But it is a challenge with sampling. It can help in the calculation, but it's just telling you how screwed you are, right? I mean, that's all it is. It's just being honest about how bad it is. All right, so let's go through some examples. This is the fun part. And you'll notice, like, I can't mention the customer. I can't even really mention the country. uh, because we're scared of them. But anyway, so this one was fun for me. I got a call at 3:30 in the morning. I'm sleeping in the suburbs of Minneapolis, and they're screaming, "NBAD is broken." And I said, "Okay, come on." And by the way, if you ever call me at 3:30 in the morning and me being sober, it's a crapshoot. Okay, so good. I mean, what is it? It's 1:30 in the afternoon now. Yeah. So I said, "What's going on?" And so we go back and we start looking at what was happening, and they had what they called mainframes. It's really just really massive computers with petabytes and petabytes worth of patient data. And they had built very tight segmentation that meant only a couple of segments inside of that network.
Hi folks, Angik here. Unfortunately, one of the video capture dongles kind of, yeah, people are hazing me in the background. One of the video capture devices froze up during the process. So all these people cracking me up. One of the video... Anyway, one of my video devices froze up, so we had to stop and start the video, but the audio from the actual talk starts back up very, very shortly. Thank you. Sorry for the inconvenience.
The organized criminals who were collecting all this information. And I really wish I could tell you what those what the cardholder stuff was for, but you're gonna have to wait another beer or two, and that camera's gonna have to go off. So the couple of things here. One, web servers don't normally say, you know what I'd like to do today? Let's just start doing FTP uploads. And if they do that, they don't normally say, let's do FTP uploads to Eastern Europe, right? Especially when you're a small municipality here-ish. Large FTP upload going I think it was about every 8 hours. Now this one was fun. I really wish I could tell you this, but this was a trade secret deal. There are some special foods that we all eat that a country in East Asia wanted to know how to make these foodstuffs. Okay, and so the way they broke in was actually pretty neat. They went and they spearphished a really stupid administrator. And so I think there are algorithms now for finding the stupidest administrator, IT guy inside the organization. I think there are forums. I haven't seen them, but there has to be, because almost 3 out of 4 of these things I go into and I sit down and I talk to the guy. He's like Forrest Gump, except way less likable, right? And so, and less skilled. Can't play ping pong either. But so they spearphished them, and it was this is an IT guy. Your password is expiring. change your password. And so he clicks on the link and he's the guy that actually changes passwords and people forget passwords. And the guy's like, that's neat. I'm glad we're doing that. It's gonna make my life easier. And he clicks on it and it asks, what's your old password? And he puts his old password and he puts a new password in. And the site comes back and says, that's not complex enough. That was cool, right? They're like, the hackers are like, dude, try harder. And so he puts in a more complex one. The attackers get it. They log in via VPN. They change his password to this new complex password to make it harder for the next set of attackers. And then through the VPN, they take control of the machine scanning the network. So if you have ever been an incident responder and you get an alarm and someone says, "Hey, IP something is," like, it's the scanner. Don't sweat it, it's a scanner. You don't even look at it. You're just so used to telling people it's a scanner. So there were 13 scanners, I think. Well, Mom say 13. There were some number of scanners inside the network. All of them, they were scanning the network like they're supposed to, but they probably shouldn't have been doing MySQL dumps across every single data store inside the network. And then they probably should not have been staging that data for FTP retrieval to a country that makes great takeout. So, GrrCON looks something like this. It's address scanning, looking for SMB file servers. And then, if you were paying attention, I've already shown you this exact same graph. So that's the data leaving the network. This one's a little kookier, and this one doesn't even really make sense because they made me take all the heart out of this one. But there is a university. They're doing, what am I allowed to say? Sensitive research. And the state-sponsored attackers, which apparently I can't even tell you where in the world they are on this one, they found the remote desktop servers, and then they just started brute forcing them until they could get into those servers. And the thing about remote desktop, if you use it, it's very the bytes coming from the server are very high compared to the bytes a client sends. You type in a couple of keys when you're typing, or the update of the position of your mouse. So it's very small data going up to the server, and you're really streaming what's on the screen. So one of the things we saw was a spike in the traffic profile. We'll redact that later, right? Okay, so the traffic profile changed to where the client part of the conversation was very high. And it is also an abnormal amount of RDP traffic. And if any of you work at a university, you have all kinds of problems to deal with. I sympathize with you, like having a class B or 2 of space that has no NAT or firewalls, and the laws of nature don't apply to tenured professors. So it's tough securing those networks. I've been there. So in this, you're going to see, this is the best I could do for a graph to show this, but there's everything going on, everything total, and then that blue blip of remote desktop traffic in comparison to it. So it was a very anomalous amount of data coming in on the inbound side. So, oh, I got one more. Man. 20 minutes. Oh, this is easy. So, okay, there's a manufacturer not far from here, east. You can guess which one it is. They pissed off some people. They said things they shouldn't have said. And so the activists or hacktivists decided that they were going to embarrass the manufacturer. So they did a SQL injection against a customer portal, published all the customer information in pastebin, and that was that attack. But that was actually that was easy to actually detect. Again, address scanning. It's very hard to do an exploit against a server until you know what it is. And so you have to find the server space, you have to recon it, you fingerprint it. Is it Apache? Is it IIS? What's the CMS running? And once you get all that done, it's very easy to exploit. What you have to do a good bit of reconnaissance, so that was easy enough. And this graph is horrible to see. But on the left, this is traffic leaving the web server going to the internet. So it was almost nothing, and then a lot quickly leaving. At the same time, the data is quickly leaving the back end going to the front end. So it's data being sucked out of the back end through the front end. That's what SQL injection looks like when you put it together, or some type of drive-by attack. So that was easy to catch from the beginning to the end, and then the forensic records putting that all together. Yes. Are there any questions? Quiet. Sure. So yeah, I like to tell people that I'm like a doctor that comes in and explains where all your cancer is, and I show you how bad it is, and then I go drink beer and golf, right? So somebody else's problem to fix all this nonsense. It is possible if you become aware of events. You can do. There's a lot of things going on for systems to communicate with each other. You can send, old school would be like a null route going to something, or a shun to a firewall, something along those lines. You can't do anything inline when you're using distributed sensors, net flow coming in, so you can't knock it off the wire like you would with a traditional IPS. But those are one option. Another thing that's come up is integration with enforcement mechanisms like NAC, like Cisco has Identity Services Engine. So it gives permission to a host. It figures out how risky it is and says, okay, your employee access. And so when you detect an abnormal behavior going on, you can come back in and say, okay, he's no longer employee access. He needs to be quarantine or internet-only access by sending a command over to ISE. Another thing that Cisco has been sponsoring is PX Grid, which is it's an open standard or open standard on how for devices to pass this information between each other. And the software iPedal participates in that, so we can pass information. But again, it's visibility really. And so when you talk about information security and compare it to martial or physical security, surveillance is the first thing that we do, right? So when I knock over the liquor store on Monroe, and after this talk, it's not going to be lasers and drop floors that are going to stop me. It's going to be, I'm going to be recognized, and they're going to arrest me and put me in jail, right? It's going to be the follow-up. It's going to be the surveillance that deters my behavior. And so really, INBAD is in that surveillance space, or should be. And then, of course, it does fit into incident response processes. What do we do when we detect something? And well, you have to. Well, there's true. I mean, but if I'm going to get robbed, law enforcement doesn't stop any crime. Right, the cops, the Grand Rapids, they've never stopped me. I can tell you that here in Grand Rapids, they've shown up afterwards, and they've told me it was a bad idea. But if anyone needs a bail bondsman in Grand Rapids, I know a couple. But there is a tie-in, though, because we moved from this place where, when I was working for InfoWorld, we did the whole movement was, let's stop bad things before they happen. Let's put enforcement mechanisms and policies so that bad things can't happen. So, but the unsaid corollary to that is, so we don't have to deal with them. And so what happened in that time is we really stopped monitoring. We had no way of validating, are we being successful in stopping them? This morning, I was working with a company that mostly makes sheetrock, and they were rooted, and they had no idea for months with attackers inside, because they're not breaking anything. They're stealing trade secret information, and they're sending it out of the network. And until you start really looking for those things, you're never going to find them. And I was joking earlier that you only catch bad malware, and that's how it should be. If you're any good at breaking into something, you shouldn't get caught. That's the way to do it. Don't get into crime if you're going to get caught. That makes it much harder to succeed, right? So, but surveillance is an important part. Surveillance, enforcement, and then response. And all of those things are going to happen. We're going to have breaches. Then how do you deal with them? And next year, maybe I'll do a talk on how to operationalize all of this. What do you do when something happens? Because I was talking with a customer a month ago, and I said, what do you guys do when you find out that there's a botnet infection? And they said, well, we pull memory forensics, and we pull the network. We start doing PCAP. We get the drives, and we start going into forensics. We figure out the indicators of compromise, and we publish that. I'm like, what? I know you guys. Who knows how to do memory forensics here? None of you guys. You guys barely know how to start your cars. There's no one here that can do memory forensics. And if you could, you do not have the cycles, because I know you have about 100 events per month. It is mathematically impossible. Like, okay, we wipe the box. I said, okay, you wipe the box. That's your process. Write it down. I said, well, most of the time we wipe the box. So it really is, the biggest problem in InfoSec is process connection. When we detect something, when something fails, what do you do? And there's this fantasy that goes on that we're not realizing. All three parts are very important: surveillance, response, but you have to do something, and you really need to know what to do before the thing comes up. Oh, that was a rabbit trail. Hey, there's other people in the room. Anyone else have any questions? Yes. What attacks are we missing? Most of our analysis is very event-centric, or it's host-centric. Almost none of it's attack-focused, meaning, so I went through something and I showed you there's GrrCON, right? That's a part of the cyber kill chain. should believe the cyber kill chain is the way that we actually do an attack. But what we're not doing is correlating all of those different events as a map to the kill chain together. And when we start doing that, we find that what are seemingly disparate events map it into a bigger incident, right? So, and what are those incidents? I think what your question is largely, it's a lot of trade secret. Trade secret theft is the hardest thing to catch. And because you don't want to get caught, because there's geopolitical ramifications for it being caught. And the other thing is the human factor. I think when we talk about cybercrime, we like to think about a dichotomy between cybercrime and everything else criminal. There is nothing keeping a cyber criminal from using traditional attacks on me, like extortion or bribery, right? Why spend 50 weeks trying to break into a network if an administrator will accept a $50,000 bribe? And so, and if the administrator is the guy who has access, he can easily also cover up the audit trail in most scenarios. So layer 8 is the easiest thing to exploit. Being, the human being is easiest to exploit, and it's the hardest to audit. But it is mostly trade secrets. The credit card stuff we eventually catch. There's a way to catch that because the business process at the tail end shows us, Charles just bought another helicopter, right? He's bought too many helicopters this month. We probably should cancel that card. And so, but the trade secrets is much blurrier and it's a longer line. What does someone do with a trade secret if they figure out how to make Doritos or whatever it is, right? What does that mean? How do we catch that? How do we know that it was actually a trade secret theft? And tying that all back is much more complicated. So secrets, I think secrets are gone, and that's a problem, right? From a business perspective as well as a personal one. Yep. So the first thing that we need to do is have a process period. And I think, so flowcharts are your best friend in any incident response plan. And MBAD is going to fit into that. For instance, on detection, MBAD as detection is going to catch those insider threats. That's going to be your best case for catching those guys inside that decided they're moving on, or they did accept a bribe, or their family is in a basement somewhere until they provide the data, right? Those things can happen. So for catching insider anomalous threats, it's important to do it, but if only you have a way to respond to it. Bringing in a tool, an MBAD tool, and turning it on doesn't solve any problems. It has to be connected to what do we do when an alarm comes out of this thing, and it can shrink. It can shrink the time there. And the other thing about MBAD, if you notice, we're not stopping anything. The exploit's already happened. You already have a compromised machine. You're catching it way later in the kill cycle, in the kill chain, right? And so, but we still need to catch it then. It's much better to catch it later than not to catch it at all. And it does fit in there. And it also helps validate enforcement. And when you go back in time and you look at those forensic records, why did this attack work? Like with the case of the L2TP tunnels, how did that actually, what can we do to change things? And in that case of that organization, they went to tokenized authentication as one way to prevent that from happening again. And so looking at those events because they're able to catch them and actually have a forensic trail of what actually occurred leading to breach. But you can't analyze a failure until you have the data, the evidence to do that. That's a good question. It's really quiet in here. I haven't been this quiet since my last trip. Am I out of time? I think I'm going to keep going, though. What do you do if I keep going? Is there a hook? You're really smiling. I'm not really scared of you. I can just keep going. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. That's me up there.